Okay, thank you all. Is this working? Yeah. Thank you all for being here today. And it's such a pleasure to introduce Professor Trevor Pinch to this group, who's Goldwin Smith Professor of Science and Technology Studies at Cornell University. And until very recently, he was the elected professor of social studies of science, of the Society for the Social Studies of Science. And I just learned that that's a fairly brief tenure, just a couple of years, so he's now off the hook and he can enjoy the Forest Conference as he used to do in the past. Professor Pinch is a pioneer in science studies and one of those people who taught us what does it mean to think sociologically about technological artifacts and technological systems. And in 2012, the 30th anniversary, 2012 has marked the 30th anniversary of the social construction of technological systems, which is a book that pretty much contains a series of lines of inquiry that have defined the field as we know it today. And also traced a number of themes that have since then been extremely relevant in the sociology of technology. And Professor Pinch himself has been involved in pushing some of these lines of investigations. For example, just to mention three of the main books that I can think of. The way in which users engage with technologies has been an important theme in his work. How Users Matter, for example, of 2003. The way in which music and sound studies can be very interestingly intersected with science studies and the methodologies that we are familiar with in science studies, and therefore the development of sonic technologies as an object for science studies. This is another major area. Analog Days is a book that came out in 2002, but this topic is still at the center of gravity of his work. And then another dimension that we can add to it is markets, entrepreneurship, and the role of materiality and agency in technology. And Living in a Material World, a book of 2008, would be another example of engaging with these issues. And as the title of this book says, Economic Sociology Meets Science and Technology Studies. And of course, I cannot not mention the Golems, these three books that are incredibly useful, and I'm very grateful every time I have to write a syllabus for an introduction to STS course that the books are there, because it's such a great collection of extremely well-written stories that I can use with my undergraduate students. And I guess I cannot conclude this introduction without mentioning another golem, which is the electric golem. And as I discovered, which is a band, a duo, I understand, of which Professor Pinch is a member. And they is electronic, experimental electronic music. And I think I need to mention the last album that came out in January, which is Smiling Like an Angry Turtle. And you can find it online.
You can like us on Facebook.
And you can like it on Facebook, yes. So with this, please join me in welcoming Professor Pinch.
Okay, well, thanks for that splendid introduction, for coming out to listen to this talk. I'll give a sketch of what I'm going to cover in the talk. I will be, actually, I've got a sort of paper. This is work in progress, but I have written a paper, so I'll be reading from bits of the paper. But I want to give you a sketch of where I'm going to go in the talk. The talk is going to bring together two aspects of things I've done in the past: sound studies and work on economics. I'm interested in particular on the role of sound in economic exchange, as my subtitle suggests, and I'm going to be drawing there for examples upon work done on financial markets, a book by Caitlin Zaloom, which is a study and ethnography of trading in Chicago and London and financial markets. There's a picture from her book there on the left. And I'm also going to draw a little bit upon Donald Mackenzie's work on how the LIBOR, an interest rate, is set and the role of sound in that. Then I'm going to move to my own ethnographic studies of economics, which date back to the 1980s when we did a lot of videos of a group of market pitchers. These are people who work on open markets in Britain, selling stuff by a verbal spiel. And also I'm going to show you a video of a street entertainer in Venice Beach in Los Angeles who draws the audience by a verbal spiel as well. And the use of sound there, there's a picture here with, from the Birmingham Bullring market in the 1980s. And now I promised also I'd say something about Goffman. So the bit about Goffman and performativity will be in that part of the talk. So I'm not framing this talk in a traditional way. Normally one gives an academic talk where you frame the sort of theory. The Goffman will sort of slide in there. And so that's what I'm going to try and do. Okay, so let me say a little bit about sound studies first. So I've been collaborating with a historian of sound at Maastricht University, Karen Besterfeld, and learnt very much from her. And in an article in 2004, we made a little attempt at defining what sound studies is. So if you need a definition, this is how we describe it. It is an emerging interdisciplinary area that studies the material production and consumption of music, sound, noise and silence, and how these have changed through history and within different societies. It's a very ambitious definition, but that's what the field of sound studies is for us. Now, back in 2004, we could say the field was emerging. We said it's emerging. This rhetoric of emerging, by the way, we've used this in science studies. I'm a professor of science and technology studies. We keep saying science and technology studies is an emerging discipline. But, you know, it's been emerging for the last 40 years, I think. So we can finally say it's emerged, I think. And perhaps the same for sound studies. Just to give you some little markers of when a field has emerged. Last year, I edited something called the Oxford Handbook of Sound Studies. When you get a handbook, it's starting to become a bit serious with Karen. And there we treat sound particularly from the perspective of science and technology studies. There's a recent Osiris volume, Instruments of Music and Instruments of Science, edited by John Tresh and Emily Dolan. There are now several readers available on auditory culture, and there's even a sound studies reader edited by Jonathan Stern out with Duke University Press. And there's even a journal, the first issue will appear next year, of sound studies that Bloomsbury is doing. And many people who work in the area of sound studies, is another indication, have taken part in a Mellon Sawyer series on sound, which is hosted by Harvard Music Department, and which runs throughout the year. And so that was an interesting experience for me. I gave a talk on some of the sounds. I've been studying the history of the Moog and Buchla synthesizers, and I was paired with a guy at the Mellon Sawyer Summit. They have two people together, who was giving a talk on Osama bin Laden's cassette collection. Very interesting juxtaposition. And I'm finding increasingly I'm getting invited to music departments. Messi was very kind to mention my little band, collaboration, the Electric Goal, and we did a performance in Ithaca, and there was a guy in the audience who introduced himself, and he was in the music department at Cornell, and he said, I have to tell you, I'm a deep Latorian. And I'm not a deep Latorian, I think I'm a shallow Latorian, but I mean, it's very interesting how ideas from our field of science studies are circulating in music departments these days. And if you think about, say, the history of musical instruments, if you think in terms of the history of technology, one can start to think that the ideas in technology studies apply to musical instruments. You can start to think about how you get users of musical instruments, how musical instruments travel from the perspective and the lens of science and technology studies, how networks are built around musical instruments. At Cornell, we have something, a humanities think tank called the Society Humanities, and we had a theme a couple of years ago on sound, culture, theory, practice, and politics. I was happy as a faculty member to be part of that theme. And it drew together a remarkable range of interdisciplinary scholars, people from comp lit, poetry, German studies, Near Eastern studies, English, philosophy, music, film studies, and there were a couple of artists there. And for me, it was an ear-opening event. Each week we heard about new facets of sound, whether the first outside radio broadcast in the Weimar Republic or radio in Cuba or Egypt. the way that sound effects were produced in the early talkies, or how sound works in musical context or in the environment. And it was a very exciting, one of those, when you used to take part in these seminars, you don't expect it to be exciting, and it was absolutely exciting. And I think part of the reason was that the usual disciplinary border patrols had gone missing, because this was a kind of new kind of interdisciplinary venture sound. And I got the same feeling for what this seminar at Harvard. Now, at these types of events, we become, and this certainly happened with me, scholars become very sensitized to sound, for instance, to our own listening practice. We also become sensitive to our own use of metaphors. So at this seminar, we are trying hard not to illuminate things or have visions for the field, God forbid, but say things like we're listening to the field, or use other sonic metaphors like, I hear where you're coming from, or let me amplify that point a bit, or that idea has a resonance. Or maybe the ring of truth to it. But of course, being good humanists, we avoided any discussion of truth altogether. So one gets sensitized to sound as a topic. One starts to notice it everywhere and to ponder its neglect. One manifestation of this neglect is the equipment on offer when you give a talk on sound. Often there's the latest video projection equipment for your PowerPoint, and someone says, you want sound as well? Like an afterthought. My worst experience of this, by the way, I was giving a talk on the history of the electronic music synthesizer, and it was doing it in a conference at the Holiday Inn. It turned out that sound, there's little tiny speakers in the roof of the Holiday Inn. And you know, these electronic music synthesizers have an incredible bass sound to them. It never sounded so thin all my life. I hope the sound, we're going to play some sound today. By the way, even that designation, you have to, one of the interesting about sound, you have to have words to describe sound. Fat sounds versus thin sounds. And why is this one of the areas where fat is desirable? In recording studio, people want fat sounds. You don't want thin sounds. So that's an interesting thing. The meaning of words to describe these sounds can change. I can recall one of the reviews of Wendy Carlos' 1968 release, Switched On Bach. It's a big record in the history of the Moog synthesizer. The review is describing these sounds as being cold. But now in the age of digital synthesizers, the same Moog synthesizers used for making Switched On Bach are valued for their warm sound. So these words change to describe sounds over time. I think one of the messages which the science studies approach to sound offers is our familiarity with materiality and technology, including, of course, instruments. So as I said, the way I approached the book on the history of the analog synthesizer was to think of it in terms of a piece of technology, and the ideas around technology stands. Look at how culture gets embedded in pieces of technology, in this case a piece of musical technology. In a way, I think we can trace the history of sound since the phonograph as an example of sound getting more and more embedded into material devices, such that sounds eventually become a commodity, something that can be worn or traded, as with digital music files. So that's all I'm going to say at the moment about the general feel. That's a little pitch, if you like, for sound studies. Now I want to say a little bit about the other thing I'm going to talk about, economic exchange. My earlier studies of the economy I want to go back to. My investigations of economic life, whether from the perspective of my own field, science and technology studies, or from economic sociology, aim to get at economic phenomena in new ways. Economic phenomena are, in my view, too important to be left to economists. So much of the work we've been doing on economic activity is an attempt to say something new about aspects of the economy and indeed about economics as a profession. Now this turn to study the economy, of course, is very prevalent in the new sociology of finance. We have great work there by Michel Calon, Fabien Muncier, and of course Donald McKenzie, Karen Norsesina, Alex Prader, and David Starr, just to list some people who are working on financial markets and the trading aspect. And Caitlin Zaloon's marvelous ethnography of futures trading in Chicago and London, which I already mentioned. Now I've been doing this work on the economy and economists for a long time. In the 1980s, when I was a young junior lecturer, as they call them in Britain, at the University of York, I was working with a professor of sociology, Michael Mulcahy, and a PhD student, Malcolm Ashmore. And we had a big project back then studying health economists. And this is at the time when a certain lady, Margaret Thatcher, was in power, and neoliberal ideas were just starting to be applied. Anyone can remember back in that period, this is when universities changed beyond all recognition, when the British National Health Service changed beyond all recognition. And part of that change came from applying economic ideas, particularly tools of microeconomics such as cost-benefit analysis, were being applied to the arena of health. And there are all sorts of very, very interesting issues, like how do you do cost-benefit analysis of life itself or death or some health outcome. Now, we published a little book on this, which came out in the mid-1980s, called Health and Efficiency, a Sociology of Health Economics. Very little known book, it's out of print now. This book contained two of the key themes of the sociology of science of the day, the so-called linguistic term. We were very interested in the rhetoric of the health economists, in particular how the rhetoric of quantification worked, how numbers and words worked together, which is crucial for understanding how a cost-benefit analysis worked. And we were also interested back then in what we used to call reflexivity, reflexive analysis. Namely, how we, as applied social scientists, namely sociologists of scientific knowledge, that's the field we were coming from, applied our own knowledge to the topic of health economics, and how we could study another group of social scientists, namely economists, who are applying their own knowledge to the arena of health. You see the reflexive twist. The reflexive analysis ran throughout the book. The book contained a play in 3 acts about health economists. We were interested in new literary forms as a way of doing this sort of reflexive analysis. A chapter laid out like a newspaper story reflected the economist's own coverage, and so we laid it out like this. It was we tried to tell our analytical story for a newspaper article, and it was reflecting their coverage in newspapers at the time. The title of the book, by the way, was a sort of reflexive joke. A joke that's maybe lost on everybody, but Health and Efficiency, our title, was actually the name of a 1960s nudist magazine. People could buy this magazine and ogle naked bodies under the guise of reading about health and efficiency. So here we were, naked sociologists looking as it were naked economists. Now, needless to say, the book had very little impact on wider sociology, but it did, funny enough, receive a big readership amongst participants in the health service. That was interesting. And maybe a few nudists. Another project we had at York in the 1980s, this is the one I want to talk about here, is we're particularly in the activities of market traders. These were not yet financial traders, but the actual so-called barrow boys who hawked their merchandise on open markets on street corners in the UK and throughout Europe. It was the early days of video. This is when video, in the mid-1980s, you could buy a camera. You still had to have this recorder separate from it, and the cameras were pretty big, but it's not like miniature cameras of today, but it was just about portable. Okay, and we took these videos on UK markets. We were very influenced by a book at the time in conversation analysis called Our Master's Voices by an ethnomethodologist conversation analysis called Max Atkinson, who does some marvellous study of Margaret Thatcher and other politicians' rhetoric. In particular, her use of 3-part lists and how applause would follow her delivery of a 3-part list. We thought it'd be kind of cool to look at how these street grafters, pitchers, were doing their spiel, and rather than leading to applause, was leading to sales. So we had one camera on the audience, typically one on the pitcher. We did this work, and it was informed by Goffman-esque sociology and conversation analysis. We're interested in how talk and gesture could be used to constitute the worth of products, and how audience could be persuaded to buy such goods. So these sorts of street traders, by the way, will return to them. I'll show you some of our original videos in a moment, were known as pitchers. They've interestingly, by the way, they've vanished from the UK market life since we wrote a book on that, and it came out in 1986, and they've vanished since then. They've shown up in the US. A lot of these guys have moved over to the US, and they're working in the infomercial and direct TV selling industry. Or else they've gone online. You see some of their same techniques in a very different electronic mediated form, which is very interesting. So other work I've done on the economy, like that book with Richard Swedberg, Living in a Material World, has been pushing on the dimension of materiality. And in revisiting the work on pitches, I realized that the material, and this is where the Goffman will come in, the material and sonic aspects of their performances, we didn't focus on back then enough, and that's what I'm going to try and draw on today. So again, going. So what I want to start thinking about is sound and economic exchange. And at core, of course, most economic exchange is money. We can think about the senses and economic exchange. For instance, there's a phrase called the smell of money, usually a bad smell. Money's been directly associated with sound in the commonly used phrase, money talks, or in the version I prefer from Bob Dylan, while money doesn't talk, it swears, obscenity who really cares. I'm an old Dylan fan, I just had to say that. Let's think of other other aspects of economic exchange, the place where it occurs. For instance, one of the iconic sounds of stock markets are the opening and closing bells of stock markets. Now, of course, in the history of stock markets, opening and closing moments were always crucial in terms of coordination, to make sure everyone starts trading together and ends trading together so that no one can secure an advantage. Now, markets, of course, these days are global markets, so the opening bell and closing bell have become less important in terms of coordination, and they're much more important as symbols. And of course, sounding the bell, or rather pushing the button, has itself become an iconic moment in capitalism, with famous figures getting to push the button on key days. Let me just see, there's the New York Stock Exchange original 18-inch brass bell, and there's a certain guy from Facebook who's actually out in their offices in California, because you just push the button. It staged as though he's really on the NASDAQ exchange, but he's actually in California pushing the button. Okay. The original bell, by the way, was found at a Lofton exchange recently, and it seems it was a huge bell and much louder, and it now hangs there for use in emergencies at the New York Stock Exchange. Stock exchange, with the move to electronic trading, have actually become quieter places, as Caitlin Zaloom documents. In her comparison of trading in the open outcry pit markets in Chicago compared with the new electronic online trading done in London, here she describes the importance of sound in the open, there's an open pit. And this is from Zaloom's work. I'll just read you this. Every bid or offer from the pit is transmitted through the voice or bulk of another trader. The numerical information cannot be divorced from the bodies through which it's conveyed and received. The tone of the voice, the body language of the trader, who may be steadily and confidently holding his hands forward in an engagement with the market, or who may be yelling his bid, spittle flying and eyes wide in desperation to get out of a trade, are crucial inflections that traders draw on to form market judgment. So she's drawing attention to the importance of embodiment of the actual traders in these type of exchange. It's not just purely economic rationality of supply and demand, etc., etc. As we know, the bodies really matter and sound matters. She describes how in a pit bursting with 600 screaming traders, how Leo first practiced his outcry trading. I love this quote. When I first got into the business, I had to go in front of a full-length mirror every night and practice screaming, looking at myself. So it matters that much. Here how she describes Victor, an ambitious young broker who's physically short and narrow, makes his presence felt in the pit. Yeah, have we got Victor here? Yeah, here's Victor. Voice is number one. You have to be controlled loud. You can't be like panic loud. There's a difference there between controlled loud and panic loud. Tones of your voice are very important. A lot of guys have higher voices, and they can really be heard throughout the pit. Zaloom also writes, by the way, the body is a key interpretive instrument for the pit trader. Listening to rhythms of the numbers that they turn into the pits leads traders to judge the market as heavy or light, likely to rise or fall according to their sensory estimations. Beyond creating the basis for individual traders' economic judgments, the ambient noise of the pit affects the market as a whole. And according to Zaloom, there's actually been studies by economists of the Chicago pits, and they found that increasing sound levels lead to higher trading volumes and foreshadows periods of high volatility. Now, of course, that's in Chicago in the open pits, and most of the open pit trading has been changed to online trading. As Zaloom notes, even in the world of screen-based trading, sound is important. This is echoed in other studies like Bunzier and Stark on their ethnography of a trading room in Manhattan. Traders, she says, try to gain contextual clues from other traders by calling across the dividers that separate them. And Bunzier and Stark noticed this, that where you sit in the trading room and who you can hear, these are crucially of importance to these traders. Donald Mackenzie, who studies financial markets, recently told me that this quietness, the quietness of the online environment, has become a problem for traders. Mackenzie tells me that when pit traders migrated to electronic trading, some got their machines instrumented so that noise levels would be artificially generated from electronic trading volumes so that they make a beep. Alex Prader tells me that because visual displays are so rapid, trading screens are programmed in such a way as to give distinctive sounds when something happens and to help traders identify what has actually happened. Thus, selling and buying are associated with different sounds, usually a succession of different pitched beeps, and attention is first mobilized through sound. So sound in the online environment is becoming important. There's another interesting aspect of sound in trading. Donald Mackenzie spent 2 days watching traders in London set LIBOR, L-I-B-O-R, the London Interbank Offered Rate. And this is the interest rate we've all heard about, the scandal, because this rate has been fixed, of course. And this is the same rate. The importance of this rate, Mackenzie noticed that it anchors contracts totaling around $300 trillion. And this is the equivalent of $45,000, Donald told me, for every human being on the planet. It's a staggering amount of money is anchored by that LIBOR rate. So it's a critical part of the infrastructure of the financial markets. Now, the LIBOR is set in a nondescript open plan office in the London Docklands. Now here's what Mackenzie says about the LIBOR rate. He says, it's the backup arrangements that provides the first hint of how much the calculation matters. Those who superintend the process have dedicated phone lines laid into their homes so they can still work if a terrorist attack or other incident stops them reaching the office. A nearly similarly equipped building is kept in constant readiness, and there's a permanently staffed backup site, which I shall describe only as being in a small town some 150 miles from London. So that's Mackenzie, just drawing the importance of this rate. Now, LIBOR is calculated from daily reports of interest rates set in certain chosen banks. It is money brokers who set the rate. Money brokers who put lenders and borrowers directly in touch with each other, charging a fee for doing so. The business is fast-moving and competition is fierce and sometimes not at all gentlemanly, as Mackenzie describes it. If you listen to brokers' voices, you hear the tones of the East End and Essex more than those of Eton or Harrow, in other words, public schools in Britain. Open-neck shirts are more common than suits and ties. While banks' dealing rooms are now often disappointingly quiet and orderly places, brokers' offices are much more raucous. Suppose a bank wants to borrow or lend in the interbank market. It's quickest and easiest to work for the money brokers. This now can be done on screen, but especially if large sums are involved or market conditions are tricky and rapidly changing, it's often better to use something called the voice box. This is a combination of a microphone, speaker, and switches that can importantly connect each broker by a dedicated telephone line to each of his clients in bank dealing rooms. So in this environment, there's a lot of noise. Also, the brokers work not as individuals, but as teams of up to a dozen or more, sitting close enough in subsections of the large open plan office. Mackenzie notes, I'm quoting from here, good eyesight is useful. This is from an article in London Review of Books. Good eyesight is useful. You can occasionally see a broker using binoculars to read a distant whiteboard or screen. But a more crucial skill is what is known as broker's ear. This is the capacity orally to monitor what is being said by all the other brokers at a cluster of desks, despite the noise, and while oneself holding a voice box conversation with a client. As one broker put it to Mackenzie, when you're on the desk, you're expected to hear everyone else's conversations as well, because they're all relevant to you. And if you're on the phone speaking to someone about what's going on in the markets, there could be a hot piece of information coming in from one of your colleagues, which you want to tell your clients. So you've got to be able to hear it coming in as you're speaking to the persons. So these brokers develop these special listening skills. So here we're talking about listening and this so-called broker's ear. I think how you can think about it, it's the sort of skill some people have. I don't have this, but if you're at cocktail parties and reception, you notice that some people have this ability to hear a conversation across the room and hear it's much more interesting than the conversation they're in with you, and they sort of vanish over there. And that's a skill, to hear a conversation like that. And it seems that that's the sort of skill that they have. So that's an interesting thing, again, in terms of sound listening. We're very interested in listening skills in this form of economic transaction. Now I'm going to show you some videos of pictures. Let's move from sound in the London markets out in Docklands to another market, namely Haringey Market in North London. I want to show you a video. It's been digitized. I used to have it on VHS, but I knew it would be impossible bringing a VHS tape here. The quality would have been better in VHS, I'm certain. I shot this in the 1980s of a special sort of market trader known in Britain as the pitcher. Now, pitchers are people who use speech and special antics to attract a crowd of people to a stall to sell large numbers of the same item in one sale. They sell mainly household goods such as towels, pots and pans, jewellery, perfume or toys, and this varies seasonally. Now, pitching is probably the oldest form of selling, and at one time, markets would have had many pitches on them, and many items would be sold in this way. Variants of pitches were probably used, pitching were probably used by hawkers in medieval fairs, from what we can tell. Pitchers operate on many markets throughout Europe, and I observed variations of their routines in the US at state fairs. This is probably one of the few places you might see if you go to a state fair. Well, they'll often be selling a gizmo like a special mop or something like that. And as we shall see, also street entertainers, who are in effect selling entertainment, also use many of the same techniques and ploys as the pitchers. Pitchers tend to be male, but I have encountered a few female pitchers as well. In the UK, the skills were passed on in families. A pitching spiel can last up to 20 minutes. Pitchers have prepared scripts, which they've learned, and the way that new pitchers learn, and as part of the study, I worked with a graduate student, Colin Clark, and he trained up as a pitcher, learned how to become one. And how you'd learn is the pitcher would say the script in the neophyte's ear, and the neophyte would repeat the script. So the guy would be whispering in your ear, and you would be saying the script. That's how you learn how to do it. He simply repeats the script word for word. Although the patter is prepared, skillful and experienced pitchers always adapt their script to the circumstances of the sale and never mechanically repeat it. Now, pitchers have their own argot or jargon. For instance, they're known as grafters. Traders who don't use speech to sell goods, they're known as lurkers. Okay, this is the jargon. The crowd gathered at the stall is known as the edge, not to be confused with a certain guitarist. The word edge comes from the Cockney rhyming slang hedge and ditch, i.e. edge and pitch. Different parts of the sale have special terms. In the video, we shall see two parts. We see something called the bat and something called twirling the edge, which is a lovely metaphor. In the bat, the pitcher announces a series of downward prices he or she will not charge for the goods. It's called batting down the price. Each price is often marked by a sound of a loud clap or a bat. Sometimes the pitcher carries a cosh or a mallet, which will be struck before each lower price. By the way, the sale technique works as one pitcher told us. It's like this. He says, to sell something cheap, you've first got to make it seem expensive. This is how they work. They ramp up the price in the description to constitute a high worth, and then they bat it down to a low price and get people from the audience to make bids to get involved with the sale. So it's known, by the way, as ramping the price, making it high worth. The other part of the sale we're going to see is this lovely metaphor. It's twirling the edge. Rather than make the multiple sales quickly, you'd think, maybe intuitively, you want to, if you've got a lot of people, you've got people interested, you'd quickly want to make their sales. No, they spin it out softly. This is where the twirling. They want to bring in more and more people, and they want to use the evidence of some people buying to persuade more and more people to join the sale. And this is where you see, it's like a spinning or twirling top. Sound is important here. The pitcher works with a pitch crew, those are the assistants, whom he hands the sold goods to, and as the edge is twirled, the crew and pitcher shout out the nature of the bargain. In this case, it's a pair of toy dolls with words like, another one, or over there, or it's the pair. The sound builds up to a crescendo to accompany the buying frenzy. I'll show you this in a second, we hope. The sale we'll see in the video occurs just before Christmas. We pick up the sale after the pitcher. There's a lot of other stuff that goes on in these sales. He's described the pair of twin dolls. He's selling a pair of twin dolls in great detail. This is called, by the way, doing the dem, describing the dolls. And you'll see this big, bulky guy beautifully caressing these little twin dolls. He's demonstrated something about the sound of the dolls. Sound figures here. When the dummy in Britain, or you say pacifier over here, has been removed from one doll, the twin doll will cry. The twin will cry. And this is the little gimmick that's selling these dolls. It's an electronic cry, of course. Then he comes to the bat. Okay, let's see. There's, by the way, there is a picture. I just want to show you some pictures of pictures. So you get just there's one selling jewellery. This is on Leeds Market. China is sold by pitching. It's a very old tradition in Britain that there's China pitching. Meat can be sold this way. This is from Selby Market in Leeds during the height of in Yorkshire during the height of the miners' strike in Britain. We filmed this, and toys are very often sold. There's a guy holding up toys. Okay, so because this is in a London accent, I hope you can get it on the video. So let's go back to the beginning. That was Jory, but you will get to the...
Don't let think together, don't let laugh together, don't let cry together, don't let drink together. Not 60, I'll give you a bus fare over, Kelcher. Not 50, not 40, 35 is cheap, not 32.50, here.
So this is the bat.
I wouldn't charge you 30. Half that, £15 a day. Over there, £15. And again, £15, son. Over there, £15. And again, £15. Have your money ready, please. Have your money ready, please. Over there, £15. And again, £15. And again, £15. Have your money ready, please. Over there. Over there, £15. Over there, £15. Over there, £15. Over there, £15. Over there, £15.
Hear the sound building up?
Over there, £15.
Happy to be on camera. Okay, so there you get the role of sound in twirling the edge, that crescendo of sound building up there. And did you manage to get what he said there okay with the accent? Yeah, good, good. I knew you were skilled interpreters here. Whoops. Let's get back to... By the way, there are the 4 stages of a pitching routine. The hardest thing to do, we'll get to this in a moment, is this very first stage where you build the edge. That is very, very difficult to do. Getting someone to stop is quite hard, getting the first person to stop, and that's often where shills or accomplices are used. You have somebody standing there already. Makes that easier. No one wants it. Another thing, by the way, associated, which is kind of funny because I noticed it today, it's like with academic seminars. The crowd wants to stand at a distance from the pitcher because they know they could be under an obligation. And you always notice in academic seminars, the seats at the front are the last ones to fill up. And the pitchers have special techniques, by the way, for moving the crowd forward. And all problematic actions are done with humour. So they'll say, yeah, I want you all to move forward. Yeah, one leg in front of the other. There's a new move. It's called walking. You know, or the closer you get to me, the closer you get to heaven. You know, little sayings like that they'll play on. By the way, issues of gender masculinity play into this analysis as well. So they do the dam, they describe and ramp the goods, then there's the bat and twirling those. And these routines sometimes last, as I said, 20 minutes. Then they'll go on to the next, there'll be a different item they'll sell in the next sale and so on. This will continue until the picture becomes really tight. It's a very stressful job because you've got to, there's all sorts of problems that occur, shoplifters, people, it can go wrong very, very quickly with people in the audience like heckling you and so on. Okay, so there's a little, in case you didn't get the dolls that think together, dolls that laugh together, dolls that cry together, dolls that drink together. Not 60, I'll give you a bus fare home that helps you. Not 50, not 40. 35 is cheap, not 32.50. Yeah, and to clear them, I won't even charge you 30. Half that, £15 the pair. By the way, it looks like he's sort of dreaming up this price. The £15 is set in advance. He knows he's going to get to £15, partly because he'll sell that same item later in the day, and if he radically changed the price, people, if they happen to have been at the sale earlier and see it at a different price, would feel cheated. That's Goffman. Okay, so this is where we get to the bit on Goffman. We're here on Goffman and performativity. So in thinking about this sort of economic activity, this sort of pitching, the approach I've been developing is one based upon a notion of performativity. So the importance of performance and performativity as a means of understanding a broad spectrum of social and cultural phenomenon has received much attention. I'm certain you're familiar with this. In theatre studies, the term; in anthropology, there's a term to performativity; gender studies with Judith Butler here at Berkeley; science and technology studies, Andy Pickering, my friend, and Michel Callan have all talked about performativity. And I'm trying to develop a notion of performativity which stems from sociologist Erving Goffman. And this is where I get a little section of the paper on Goffman and material performativity. And we all know that Goffman, I'm particularly talking here about early Erving Goffman, in Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, he talks about interaction as a form of drama, publicly witnessable performances of the self. Different forms of social interaction can be delineated for different sorts of setting, such as his well-known front stage, backstage distinction. But Goffman's studies, like that of much sociology, underplay the materiality of the settings he investigates. So in developing a theory of what I call material performativity, suitable for sound studies, I argue that we need to reread Goffman, paying more attention to the material elements, including sound, which mediate and stage social interaction. That's a kind of theoretical project. Now, sound studies scholars, such as I can mention some here, Brandon LaBelle, Emily Thompson, and Jonathan Stern, have argued that sound serves as a form of architectural infrastructure. For instance, shopping malls are demarcated in terms of the sorts of sounds encountered, and each store these days defines what we might call an acoustic territory. By the way, shopping itself is an activity where sound is important, such as the ringing of the cash register, showing that another sale has occurred. Now, I like this term from Brandon LaBelle's sonic territory to demark sound and space, because shopping these days is very much like entering enemy territory in terms of sound. There's a stall in this mall in Ithaca where I go to. I hate going into this one stall with my daughter when she was 14 years old. It was called Arrow Pastel. I don't know if you have this store in Berkeley. It's probably a global chain, right? Because of the sort of music they play, which my daughter loves. I'm just showing my age here. It gets better because all these stores have a different sort of music. So the older daughter, she goes into more upmarket stores, sort of Loft and Express, and they noticeably play a more indie rock type music, which is much more to my taste. By the way, the whole area of music as a way to motivate people, such as music and shopping and music while you work, this is an area that people have studied, and music while you exercise. Scholars like Tia Denora, Jonathan Stern and Brandon LaBelle have looked at that in more detail. Now, returning to Goffman. Goffman is one of the few major sociologists to pay attention to sound, mainly because of his interest in radio. He contrasted, for instance, the thick glass panels found in a radio broadcasting room, which isolates an area orally, but not visually, with the beaver board portions found in American office, found in American offices in the 1950s, which do the opposite. So they screen you off by sight, but allows sound to travel. How regions for social interaction are produced and maintained is crucial to Goffman's analysis, such as with the backstage, front stage example. This distinction is drawn from his famous ethnography of the Shetland Islands Hotel, which formed the basis for his book. This was his PhD dissertation, Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, published in 1959. He noticed that the presentation of self by the service personnel in the front stage, or he called it the parlour, part of the hotel, where guests were to be found, was very different from the crofter behaviour found in the backstage kitchen and scullery. In the parlour and dining room, the hotel personnel followed what Goffman called the middle-class norms of politeness and presentation of food. Backstage, however, things were very different. Quote, I think I've got a quote here from, here it is. Crofter clothing and postural patterns also tend to appear in the hotel kitchen. Thus, the manager would sometimes follow local custom and leave his cap on. The scullery boys would use the coal bucket for a well-aimed expulsion of mucus. Women on the staff would rest, sitting with their legs up in unladylike positions. This is Goffman, 1959. The front stage parlour and the backstage kitchen thus have to be materially separated, in this case visually and sonically. One does not want to see or hear the expulsion of mucus while one is dining. Okay. So this front stage, backstage, so I've got really made the point, Goffman's attending to the materialities, attending to how materials affect sound. I don't think there are many sociologists who do that, that's why I'm particularly interested. In analysing pitching, regions are crucial. Pitchers and street entertainers work on streets or open markets. there's no compunction for anyone to stop and listen to their routine. So as I said, the hardest task the pitchers face is to get someone to stop at the stall, known as pulling the edge. And pitchers have developed these special techniques to do so. Essentially, the task the pitchers face can be thought of in Goffman's terms as getting people to move from backstage to front stage, where you don't have any actual physical barrier to do it. This is what they're trying to do. Now, one remarkable social feature of the informal organization of space is the way that spaces, like the ones that pitchers and entertainers work with, they have designated as front stage, become bounded areas and governed to separate social norms. If you should doubt this, watch how passers-by navigate the space where a street entertainer and his audience occupies a public space, such as a city centre square. You've got every right to walk through that crowd, but people don't. So they attend to it that this space has been a specially constituted front stage space by the pitcher or the street entertainer. I'll show you, we'll get to that in the video from Venice Beach in a moment. There may be no formal reason not to cross the square by the most direct route possible, but people always avoid transgressing the space occupied by the street entertainer and his or her crowd, even if there are gaps in the audience for which they could move physically unimpeded. In short, casual passers-by attend to the fact that they may unwittingly move from back to front stage in a show of which they want no part. Audience members are aware that standing at a pitching stall is itself a performative act. When walking through the market or street as individuals or in small groups, such as a family or with friends, the audience are in effect backstage, but once they stop at the pitching stall or stop to listen to the entertainer, they start to become front stage. That's to say, their activities, including their stance and spoken responses, are now publicly witnessable and accountable to the pitchers and by fiat to other audience members. And you sometimes see people to try and avoid this. They'll avoid eye contact. They'll stand with defensive postures like this. The pitcher moves towards them. You can see it's choreographed. They'll often move a step back because the audience knows very well what's happening as well. They're not dummies, you know, cultural dummies. They know, or cultural dopes, as Garfinkel has said. They know what's happening as well. This finely balanced choreography between pitcher and audience members can be thought as an attempt by audience members to try and establish more of a backstage presence for themselves, while pitchers struggle to position audience members more fully front stage. Because it's the hardest thing to get someone to stop, pitchers, as I say, have developed these special techniques to do so. Sometimes they throw away or give away very cheap items at the start. Another technique is, as I mentioned before, is to use the accomplice, the shill in America, the rick in the UK is the name. Often getting the first person to stop is the hardest thing. Okay, so let's get on to the example of seeing this. This is the best, I always like to get to examples. So by the way, there's a Paris street entertainer, just so you can see that we took this shot in Paris. Before we get to this, I want to show you this now. We're going to move to Venice Beach. I want to show you the street entertainer and how he uses sound to get the audience to stop and how he constitutes them. You'll see these issues I've been talking about. In this case, we'll see a street entertainer I filmed at Venice Beach, Los Angeles. This street entertainer, by the way, is a comedian. When I filmed him in Oh, he's started. Hang on. Sorry. There he is. Hang on. Let's just start again. I just want to hit this. Pause a second. His name is Michael Collier. I filmed this in 1985. He was undiscovered then. There's now a statue on Venice Beach to him. He's become a minor Hollywood star now since then. This was filmed before he was known. I just happened to be visiting a friend who was a grad student at UCLA, and she told me there's some interesting people you'd be interested, because you study pictures, go down to Venice Beach, and I started filming. And I saw this guy very early on. I thought, this is amazing. He's doing what the pitcher's doing it, but he's doing it in a very different context, but using similar sorts of techniques. So here he's using sound. He's got a klaxon horn there. He's sounding to attract the audience. This is him. I'll just play you the piece. There's no one there at the moment. Now watch how he gets this crowd. Folks, I got jokes. So he's talking to a non-existent person. So he marks the space. I'm not going to stab you. Black comedian, maybe he'll stab you. Notice how it's important for him to make contact with the audience, shakes hands with them, comes back, and he's going to point me out now. 5 minutes of comedy, I'll send you on your way. They're never going to get dirty.
How you doing, man? I hope this ain't for network because you've been taking pictures like crazy. And I didn't see your ass coming in my bowl when I was passing out the collection. Did you make it?
Lighter man.
Huh? Lighter man? Where you from?
BBC.
So he uses a very common trick here. He's going to get them all to applaud to make even more sound, to attract even more people. It's part of building the edge. This is a standard technique. So he's obligating the audience. If you don't laugh, I'm going to come and do nasty things to you, call you out. Okay, we'll leave Michael there. So there's several things to notice about this. There's lots of things you can notice about this. But I mean, the key thing is how he goes from nobody standing there to that big audience there. He's managed to constitute that as the front stage, if you like, in Goffman terms. He uses sound for the initial pulling of the pitch. He does it by running out onto the boardwalk, sounding an air horn, shouting and gesticulating. Notice how he uses sound again to grow his audience by getting them to shout and clap and thereby attract more people. Notice his sense of spatial and sonic architecture as he constructs an imaginary stage from which he'll perform and from which the audience will watch. Sound is not enough to define the stage, and he marks out an imaginary line on the boardwalk where he wants the audience to stand. Notice how he's aware of everything in his environment. Pitchers and skillful street entertainers like Collier are always like this. They're opportunists who turn everything in their environment, including the presence of the researchers and their camera, to their advantage. It's very common in Britain, by the way, for the researchers to see us there with these big cameras. And they would immediately incorporate us into the act, saying, "You're going to be on TV, ladies and gentlemen. We're doing a TV commercial here. The goods are cheap while the TV commercial is running." So they would incorporate us as researchers into their selling spiel. And that's how they work. They improvise, they're opportunists. That's their standard way of working. Okay. And by the way, we worked with one group of pitchers on Leeds Market. I just had to tell you this little story about it. And I was driving a VW Bug, and Colin, the grad student, he and I would go to the market, Leeds Market, on our VW Bug and park. And we'd have a really crappy little video camera. And these guys at Leeds Market said, "It looked much better if you looked like a proper TV company when you did this. Could you smarten up a bit?" So what we did, we went to the audiovisual unit and got one of those clapper boards, with another sonic technology, and we'd always go, "Take one," before we started with that. And they were happy with that. I like this because we were using them for our project, studying selling, and they were using us for their project. It was a nice mutual beneficial relationship between researchers and you don't always have it that way, but that was nice. Another thing to notice, by the way, in that is that the entertainer makes it clear that standing as an audience member involves an obligation. They'll often be expected to participate and eventually pay for the entertainment. That is, if they try and slink off without paying, he may call them out. And the market pictures are very aware of this. They're trying to obligate people. It's a process of putting someone under an obligation. The first moment you stop there is when that obligation process starts. They're going to work on you to obligate you. Let me just show you an example of how this is done on my last bit of video. Pitchers have a saying for doing this, their own phrase again. They call it getting the forks up. What they often do is they ask the audience, who would be interested in this goods if I sold it at such and such a price? Put your hand up. They call the hand the fork. Get your forks up. And they'll ask the audience to put their hand up, and then they will count them out in public. And once you put your hand up, you're under a stronger obligation to buy. You haven't been asked to buy, you've been asked if you're interested, but you've got your hand up. And here's where the sonic control is important, because the picture and the visual, the picture can see you, count you out, he can count out more, he can count out people behind you that don't exist, that's a very common technique, and count them out, 1, 2, 3, 4, and we'll see that happening now. And so rendering, the picture's got control here of this sonic and visual space, and all responses from the audience are rendered by the pitcher back again, who often, by the way, has a loud voice, or often will have an amplification, little microphone and loudspeaker. This picture we're going to see, getting the forks up, is on Leeds Market, Glen. He's got a very, very loud voice.
Look, if I give you those 4 pence for nothing, and I charge you $5.90,
He's selling pens.
and you have a bargain, but I'm here to promote them, and I'm prepared today to do it like this. Forget the price of 4, you get those for nothing, but take from the fountain pen, I won't charge you $5.95, I won't charge you $3.95 or $1.95, in fact I'm not even charging them. A pound in 10 pence for all the 5 of them. Now, who can use them if I go to the lower than a pound 10 pence? Right now. 1, 2, 3, 4. I can only do it for so many. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Yes, he's counting them out.
Here's what I'll do with you. First come, first serve.
Okay, that's called getting the forks up. Sometimes, by the way, they use a device called the nailer. They actually hand out bags to people who say who's interested, and they'll give them a bag. And that's called the nailer, the bag. Because once you have that bag, you're on an obligation to the goods that's going to be sold. He doesn't give them the final price yet to put those goods in the bag. And people very rarely, it's called jebbing out. If you don't take the goods, it's called jebbing out. People very rarely jeb out. So that technique of nailing people with the physical materiality of the bag, and the implication the bag is for the goods, is what nails people to the spots, and that's called the nailer. Okay, you can see these techniques in other things like 3-card Monte, other sorts of sales. We could go on. There's lots of different sorts of examples. Now, I just want to go back to my PowerPoint. I just want to show you summarize with a few systematic things about pitching. I want to say something briefly about online selling. So here's the performativity of economic exchange. Sounds and other material props, let me just get this enlarged, excuse me, and material props are used to architecturally define this interactional stage, I suggest with front stage, backstage. Action of exchange participants are performatively accountable, and so everything you do there is accountable, and the pitcher will call you out. These performances, by the way, are built incrementally. The pitchers do it in stages, an increment at a time. First you get the crowd to stop, then you dem the goods, then you constitute the worth, you ramp it, then you do this bat down. Responses are rendered to be unequivocal. This is a really interesting feature of this. Notice that the hand is either up or it's down. It's not in between. It's a really important point. It's rendered. Somebody, it's like, I may have doubts about this. I'm not certain if I'm interested. Yes, I'm interested. Your hand is up, okay? You have a marker on you. So they render things into an unequivocal form. This is a very interesting point, I think, when you think about online selling away, about how there's no room for, in the digital world, for equivocation, okay? Obligations become more and more ineluctable as actions become more and more embedded in materiality to actually finally take the goods. So materiality really matters here because they want you to take these material goods. And when you've actually taken those goods, you're going to pay for those goods. And so materiality is really important here. The sonic exchange, the pitcher, as I said, has the upper hand in terms of sound. I can talk about more of these points if you like, but I think I've got most of the points here. Now, briefly, I want to conclude by talking a little bit, lastly, about e-commerce. Now, in e-commerce, it's kind of interesting. It's mainly a silent world. You think we've all bought on Amazon. When you're clicking on Amazon and buying, there isn't much sound involved. There's an interesting story. I found one interesting story of sound with Amazon, which is the largest e-retailer on the planet. And this is in this book by Robert Spector on the early history of Amazon. He describes the very first week at Amazon. This is when they're starting to sell books. He says this: very soon the company received its first paying customer. It's very exciting when you get your first customer who's not a relative, cracked Jeff Bezos. Barton Davis, a computer programmer who was the company's second ever employee, thought it would be a great idea to have a gauge of how much activity the site was generating. So this is the first week of Amazon. To this end, he tweaked the web server code, so every time the company made a sale, a command sent a message to all of the computer screens in the company, which would cause a nice loud beep. And an on-screen message flashed the amount of the sale and the number of books sold. Whenever they heard the beep, the Amazonians would let go with a rousing cheer. At the end of the first week, Amazon took orders totaling $12,438. So I think that sonic practice has stopped at Amazon. We know very little about Amazon because Amazon famously is secretive, won't let ethnographers in to study them. But it's very interesting that early week, how sound, again, played a role in that early week of generating excitement with that beep. So here's one of the paradoxical implications of the role of sound on the web. One of the studies I've done of web, I looked at web technology, was looked at an online music site called Acid Planet. It's owned by Sony, and it's for digital download of files. It offers a software, a bit like GarageBand, so you can edit your own music creations. You can they have competitions there for mashups and so on. And this site is inhabited mainly by amateur musicians or wannabe musicians. And I did this study about 9 years ago. But what's very interesting about, and I think I've got here a picture of the, that's the thing about Amazon. There's the website for this Acid Planet, is that though it's about sound, and they also do videos, everything is rendered into a visual form on the website. They don't use sound. It's rendered into a visual form of judging how they have the top 10 which are voted by users in terms of reviews that they give. It's a reviewing site, and it's very interesting to me that many of these sonic sites themselves in the online world have become kind of visual sites, and they use visual technologies mainly in terms of, it's a reputation system, I'd say, dominated by words and symbols. So in a way you can say the review system, I mentioned that you post reviews of bits of music, it transduces sound into words about sound, and then a numerical ordering in a review ranking, chart position and so on. Of course chart position is a very old technology for judging music. So reputation systems in the online world, which one can think of as a form of exchange system, seem to work mainly in the symbolic arena and seem to make less use of sound. So in conclusion, what I've argued today is that economic exchange should be a topic of great interest to sound studies, such as the special listening skills known as broker's ear, setting this important number for global capitalism, or the way the sound is employed in the activities of street sellers, or the way that sound can still elicit excitement and signify economic activity even in the era of e-commerce and online trading. All the exchanges we have examined, whether mediated by online technology, the technology of voice boxes or air horns and amplification systems, involve performativity, sound and materiality. Sound not only enables people to perform identities, but it provides part of the hidden infrastructure whereby social relationships and economic relationships are themselves performed. And I'll shut up there. Thank you.
Let's open the floor for questions.